Hello and welcome to Newcastle for those of you who are visiting us, and welcome to this room for everybody. And welcome to our two-day workshop and centre launch. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are currently holding this event, which is the Pambalong clan of the Awagawa people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to kick things off by talking a bit about how we came to be a centre, and doing a little bit of shameless self-promotion in that context, and then we'll kick off the kind of intellectual aspects of the event. So in 2014, me and Julia Coffey got a job here. And that was a big day for us. As you can imagine, here we are. At the time, the sociology of youth was a small but emerging nucleus within what was then the school. As time went on, we worked together, did projects together, we got an ARC together, we got new colleagues in disciplines like anthropology, in disciplines like human services, formed new relationships, and built what I think is a kind of genuinely supportive and intellectually lively community. In that process, whilst working together, we also had a series of strategic decisions, as you do, about how to enhance our presence, develop our internal institutional clout, and, promote ourselves internally and externally. Because that's really what centres do to a certain degree. So we were a group, and then we became a network, which is, just another name for kind of a bigger group. And then we became a centre. And so here we are. The thing that I kind of want to say about the fact that we are a centre now is that the thing that perhaps that I'm most proud of is the fact that we have retained that sense of community that we had kind of from the beginning. The working relationships that we have are strong and very satisfying. They are nice. They are intellectually supportive and warm. And I think that that is a really excellent foundation for the existence of a centre like ours, even amongst all of the strategic and institutional positioning that you were always doing within universities to kind of, develop your agenda. So that's number one. The centre is now, has a kind of interdisciplinary scope beyond what we were initially used to when we first started at the university. We have people from anthropology, industrial relations, human services, and of course sociology as well. I think that we are a strength within our school, and that we will continue to grow. As a representation of the kind of work that we have done, we have our first centre report. Now, this report, I have to admit, is a slightly awkward mixture of self-promotion and genuine intellectual argument. But anyone reading that will get a sense of that when they look at it. But the report is built on the work that we are doing within the centre in three areas, all of which you'll all get a sense of today over the course of the sessions. The report looks at the relationship between young people and money, young people and work, and young people and well-being. And in that context, foregrounds what I think unites all of the work that we do in the centre, which is a critical, socially engaged and reflexive analysis of youth that goes beyond the kind of business as usual approach of much youth research, which sees young people as a kind of problem to be managed more than anything else. So if you have the chance to flip through that report at some point in your life, that would be, I'm sure, very edifying. Last week at a conference, Steve Threadgold said to someone in a rather glib way that our centre was an imagined community. And the reason he said that was because the university is some time away, I think, from seeing fit to do anything like give us a building, right, or anything like that, or even any money. But the thing about imagined communities is that they have tangible consequences. And in forming this imagined community together and in producing a piece of print media, which according to Ben Anderson's theory of imagined communities is key to kind of keeping the imagination going, I hope that we will kind of, have an enhanced material presence as well as an imagined presence. And I hope that we will also, be able to continue to solidify the very real kind of relationships and identifications that hold us together as a community. So that's all I really wanted to say in terms of talking about the centre as such. Here we are, we exist. We hope that we will be able to expand our connections with all of you into the future, with other centres, networks, or just interested researchers floating around various universities around the country and around the world. So welcome, thank you to all of our guests who've come in some instances from a very long way and in some instances, from places like Melbourne. We hope you enjoy the next couple of days, and that's that. Here we are. The centre is now launched. All right. Now, do either of you two want to say anything before we kick things off? All right. Yeah. Cool.
So, just got some housekeeping. But before that, we just want to also thank the school for supporting us, particularly Kathy Colborne. When she was head of school, she was central to kind of supporting us to get up. Particularly also to Catherine Oddie, who's been a big supporter of us back before we were even a group, in terms of making this and building the momentum for it to happen. So thanks, Catherine. That's great. Two housekeeping things is if you need Wi-Fi, if you haven't got the EDU Roam, I put it up in my terrible handwriting on that whiteboard over there, so please log into that. And the second quick thing is that we're having lunch 4 stories up on level 5 in the nice balcony up there. So the trouble with that room is you do need a swipey thing to get in, so follow me or Elsa to do that at lunchtime. So that's about it for that kind of stuff. And may as well just get straight into the thing. So it's going to be about 15 minutes each, 5 minutes for questions.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. Me again. Hello. The first session will be looking at various facets of a project that we have been working on together, this team consisting of myself, Julia, Steve, Megan Sharp, who's over there, and Lena, Molnar, who's there, looking at young hospitality workers in the service economy. I'm going to do 2 things in my talk. I'm going to introduce the project, and then I'm going to give you one empirical kind of angle on what the project is finding. So hopefully I will do that in a relatively timely manner. We do have a little bit more time, but anyway, I'm not just going to suck it up. All right, so this is a project that's been running in various facets since about 2017, where we did a small pilot looking at young bar workers in Melbourne, and then upscaled with an ARC that ran for a few years after that, finishing last year. The project aims to look at how labour performed by young people in the hospitality industry contributes to the creation of economic value, and to examine the practices through which young hospitality workers produce value in terms of identity construction. So the aim here is to look at how youth identity construction produces value within hospitality, and to look at how the personal capacities and identities that allow young people to be a good hospitality worker relate to the disciplinary requirements of labour within the industry, and also revealing an array of forms of exploitation, risks, and in fact violence that young hospitality workers are exposed to. So we're particularly interested in how new forms of labour converge to blur the lines between work and play, creativity and exploitation, aesthetics and gentrification in the hospitality industry. Conceptually, one of the things that's going to be lurking in the background of all of the papers in different ways is theories of effective labour coming from autonomous Marxism, which we found useful for a few reasons. First, the concept of effective labour describes the creation of sensations and subjectivities as products of work. This is useful for understanding service labour because it draws attention to an important but poorly understood aspect of interactive service work, which is the creation of feelings as part of a commodified consumption experience. In 2018, we published a paper in the Journal of Youth Studies which included this quote from a young hospitality worker describing what the key task that he was faced with at work. And he said, "Bartending isn't rocket science. A chimp can pull a beer. The key thing for me at work is I need to contribute to the production of vibe, a vibe." And I said to him, "Okay, what is the vibe?" And he said, "Okay, put it this way. Je ne sais quoi." Now, I have to say most of our participants did not talk like this. Nevertheless, je ne sais quoi. Do you know what that means? In conversation, when people talk about je ne sais quoi, what they're talking about is the indescribable something that makes something what it is. The moment of enjoyment. Vibe is that, right? I mean, so that's what vibe is. You almost don't need to theorise it. Basically, what we're wanting to do is look at the specific social relations and practices through which vibe is produced, and to look at the consequences for workers of having to produce vibe in different kinds of contexts. Young people doing hospitality work contribute to the production of vibes, sensations of ease, pleasure, and enjoyment that are offered to clientele. The vibe is the product of the work, and the specific challenges and processes that young people go through in creating the vibe are really related to the unique nature of vibe as a product of work. Vibes, affects are produced relationally in ways that blur the boundaries between the inside and the outside of work. In autonomous Marxism, this comes under a kind of grand theory of the dissolution of the boundaries between the inside and the outside of work, in which kind of everything becomes work, every form of subjectivity becomes connected with value, even if it's not enacted within a specific employment relationship. And the idea in these theories is that effectively a worker's entire subjectivity is enrolled into the creation of value. In our pilot, an example of this was the way that membership of taste cultures and music scenes and a capacity to mobilise particular leisure practices became capacities for labour. So young people that were in, for example, particular bands became really good employees for particular bars that serviced those music scenes. And Hartenegger would see this as a way that capacities for leisure are enrolled into value creation, and an example of the way that subjectivity in general is enrolled into value creation. But we are in this project also interested in the way that this project relates to the disciplinary requirements of labour in the service economy. So we want to emphasise that this is not just a sense in which all aspects of subjectivity are incorporated into value creation, but rather work remains a scene of disciplined relational performances that are enacted in relation to the requirement to make value, and that this is key to the way that effective labour takes place, and this is also key to issues like gender and sexuality, and the relationship between social class and hospitality labour in our project. So at the moment, we are still actually collecting data. Lena is currently doing a series of interviews for us because our project on hospitality labour happened during the pandemic, which basically, well, yeah, fucked everything up, let's be real. But we still have money floating around, and the data is still coming in, but our analysis has been going on for years now, and I think is pretty mature. We've also done some participant observation across a whole range of venues, taken some photos, done some photo voice. So what I'm going to talk about over the next little while is the way that the social relationships of workers, of hospitality workers, are enacted in relation to the hospitality labour process. So, conceptually, the concept of effective labour would teach us that workers' private social lives are subsumed into the hospitality labour process, such that the inside and the out, and such that there's no distinction between public and private social relationships in their lives. However, there is a literature on the way that precarious workers, especially in the media and creative industries, manage their relationships. And basically what this literature emphasises is that workers are actually not that enthusiastic about having their entire private lives subsumed into work. Instead, what this literature shows is a series of competing imperatives faced by precariously employed workers who need to manage relationships between fluid networks in order to access employment, whilst also being fun. And being fun is key to really to so much service employment. So there's the need to be fun, there's the need to manage access to work, and there's also a need to do things like negotiate contracts and payment. So inspired by this, the rest of my talk is going to look at the way that workers manage these competing social relationships, manage these competing imperatives, in the context of the need to be fun at work and to produce vibes, to produce atmospheres of enjoyment. And what I'm basically going to argue is that is that the distinction between their friendships and their working relationships, or another way of saying that is that the distinction between their public social life and their private social life is not so much dissolved in hospitality labour, but rather posed as a problem for workers to negotiate in the context of their labour practices and their engagement with the labour market. So we talked to workers over the last few years about their social relationships, their relationships with people at work, and the way that their relationships at work related to their friendships outside of work. Workers said that potentially the relationships they had within their workplaces were potentially quite close and relatively intense. In fact, workers in hospitality venues, you get paid the same basically regardless of where you work. So after spending some time in the industry, all that really matters in terms of where you're going to work is the people you're working with, and there's sometimes a process of kind of identifying with the venue to a certain degree. But working with people you like is very important to hospitality workers. Good relationships were an important and very desirable aspect of the work, but they weren't just a perk of the job. So the ability to form friendships with people at work and relate properly to others is a requirement of hospitality labour, and it's connected to the nature of hospitality labour as demanding and relationally intense, requiring teamwork and a cool demeanour in a fast-paced environment. One of our participants described this as the necessity to be able to hang at work. She said, you need to be able to hang in order to be a good hospitality worker. What does that mean? So here she is. She says, there are a lot of really cool people that walk through those doors, the doors of her venue, and that she works in like a kind of inner city Melbourne bar. There's lots of really cool people that ask for jobs, but to get a job behind that bar, you kind of have to be able to hang. It was just a level of whether you could hang, whether you're cool enough, chill enough to get by, having a laugh on shift when things are getting tense. If you're able to break the ice in those heated moments, that's going to take you a long way. When I say you can hang, I mean it's a tense job that can often be fast-paced, and if you keep a cool head and a good disposition while you're doing that, that's the crux of what i.e. the employers, are looking for. Look, I'm a chilled, laid-back, jokey type. It makes sense to me that you hire people you know are going to be good at the job and enjoyable to be around. So, what qualifies Olivia to be a good bar worker? The fact that she can hang. Olivia's ability to hang means that not only is she fun to work with, but she can break the ice and have a laugh with others during a shift. This is important because hospitality workers are often getting quote-unquote slammed. They use this term a lot to describe busy periods of work, when you get slammed. When you get slammed, there's a lot of orders coming through. You have to work quickly. There's a lot of pressure. And so you need to be working with a team who can hang with each other. A worker who can hang facilitates the labour of their co-workers and creates an atmosphere of enjoyment rather than tension over the course of a shift. And these shifts might involve challenging interpersonal encounters, a lot of physical exertion, things like this. So part of a hospitality worker's job is not simply to facilitate an experience for a consumer, but actually to facilitate the labour of their co-workers and to create an atmosphere of easy relationality and fun that then allows co-workers to do all the things they need to do during a shift, including to produce vibe. So you have to be able to hang. And workers talk about the fact that if someone can't hang and they have a bad vibe, it makes it harder to have the right vibes within a venue. So here's a participant saying, I feel like it's easier to catch. Like when someone's really lacking energy or having a shit time, it's easier to sense and everyone struggles a bit. When you don't want to be there, your brain is elsewhere, you're not feeling very good, then you have to do all these tasks, you have to be engaging with customers. If you're feeling really shit in an office, you can go for a walk, get a coffee, take a breather. But when you're in a cafe and there's 3 of you on, you just have to suck it up and keep doing. So basically, a worker who can't hang makes it harder for other workers to create the vibe required. So the task is not simply to create an atmosphere to consumers, but to also to create a kind of transpersonal affective experience that is shared amongst workers and consumers and that facilitates both labour and consumption. When this goes well, they love it. They say when it goes well, there is an experience in which people are relating in such a way that is just so easy and effortless. So here's a participant that says, I feel like with the bar, all sorts of things, when it works well, it's like a real machine. It's really well oiled. Everyone glides around each other. Everyone has to be really working hard for it to work well. It's such a small amount of space that you've got. There's a lot of you working. So when workers can hang and when they're relating to one another easily, even the kind of their bodily comportment at work is affected and facilitated, often within the very cramped physical environments that they need to work in. So being able to hang, facilitates the kind of moment-to-moment corporeality of a shift. But it's not just enjoyment. It is a requirement of work. If you cannot hang, you will not work out in a venue, i.e. you will be asked, you will be let go. You won't be given any more shifts. So here's a manager of a bar here in Newcastle saying we have the lowest staff turnover of any venue in Newcastle. It comes down to how staff deal with people and how they deal with staff. You've got to be able to muck in with the staff as well because we're a tight-knit group and there's a certain amount of banter. So you need to be able to participate in this banter. If you can participate in the banter, that makes you a valued employee. So it is compulsory to be able to hang. And if you cannot hang in a venue like this especially, you just won't work out. Because being able to hang reduces staff turnover, a big problem in hospitality, and contributes to the atmosphere of enjoyment that patrons of a venue are seeking. As well as this, the necessity to hang shapes workers' private relationships. Workers in hospitality are socialising at weird hours of the day or night, typically, and there is a whole social scene populated largely by young hospitality workers without families or financial responsibilities extending beyond their living expenses. This is what they call a hospo scene. There is a hospo scene consisting of late-night bars that will take people who've just knocked off work at 3 a.m. And consisting of hospitality workers hanging out with each other. These relationships are enacted and solidified outside of work while socialising with other workers, but they facilitate the labour process because they make it easier for you to hang. They give workers a sense, in a kind of embodied sense, of what's required of them relationally in the industry. So here's a guy saying, basically, after a really rough shift, you want to hang out. We work a lot during the week. We're knackered. We don't have time to go out and drink or socialise most of the time. So if we have a Monday or Tuesday where the majority of other hospitality people are free, we're going to rendezvous and get silly. So it's just hospitality people we can all relate. Their participation in this scene is key to their access to employment. And the reason for this is that access to employment in hospitality is based on informal relationships and networks. So basically they all said, look, in hospitality you get work through your friends. So here's someone saying, basically, I find work through friends or bars that I go to as a consumer. When people know I'm looking for work, they'll be like, oh, there might be some shifts going over here. Places that I've applied for on the internet or resume drops and that are usually places that I don't stay for very long. Why? Because there isn't that sense of how it is that everybody hangs together in a venue. And so perhaps Cassie doesn't work out so well in the venue or doesn't enjoy working there. So when workers heard of the opportunity to see work in a venue, there was a relatively informal but very relationally complex process in which they ended up or did not end up with work on the basis of an owner or manager's initial impressions of them. So workers have to turn up to a first shift or a chat with the manager. They confront an ambiguous situation in which they have to appear likeable without explicit guidelines as to what this will involve. And this was based, they said, on a kind of intuition. Here's a fairly experienced bar worker, and she describes this process. And she says, so you'll meet the owner or manager or whatever and be like, hello, my name is such and such. And they'll have a look at you and they'll smell you like an animal. And you sniff each other out a little bit and you're like, okay, this might be all right. You can have a trial and you get hired based on your trial. Bar work tends to involve a lot of intuition. A lot of what you do is intuitive. The way you respond to people is intuitive. The way you deal with problems is intuitive. And certainly the way that people get hired can be intuitive. If you give someone a resume and say, I've worked in bars for 10 years, but at the end of the day, you don't really like the other person, the way they smell or the way they do things, you're not going to get along and you're not going to consider working there. So love the SLIF test. Incredibly effectively evocative metaphor, which describes a kind of intuitive assessment of a worker's relational style. Other managers talked about asking workers about their taste in music, looking at, like, there was one guy that said, we don't hire people who listen to Triple J, looking at the clothes that they were wearing, things like that. The idea here is that there's a kind of informal process of, are you going to fit in? Are you going to be able to hang? If a worker appears likeable, fun to be around, and likely to fit in with the other staff, then they will work out, and so then they are hired. So in conclusion, the relationship between the public and the private in workers' lives is not just a generic aspect of effective labour in general, but it manifests as a tension that is strategically negotiated by workers according to the demands that hospitality labour places upon them. The necessity to hang is connected to the fact that hospitality is effective labour, which produces affects of leisure and enjoyment in precarious and physically demanding situations. So the way that workers negotiate this is a key aspect of the way that the whole labour market works. The incorporation of workers' relationships into their jobs is therefore less a generic aspect of subjectivity and more a set of relational capacities produced through the material conditions of work. Okay, that is the end of me. Thank you. I went 5 minutes over time, but I had to talk about the project. Yeah.
There's any questions? I just bring this around. We can
No.
Thanks, Sam.
I am.
Okay, anyone got any questions? Or Dave?
That was great. But I wondered how applicable that framework would be to more kind of more suburban, less cosmopolitan, more peripheral centres where things have to be a bit more mundane and slow. It felt like it was in the centre of Melbourne rather than in the centre of basically not.
Yeah, that's a fair question. And so one of the things that we keep trying to do in this project is capture more kind of mundane, mainstream consumption venues. We talked a lot about trying to get suburban RSLs. I don't know if you know what an RSL is, but anyway, it's like...
So it's landlord.
Okay, well, yeah, it isn't that. But anyway, the point is, yeah, so I probably don't have heaps to say about that aside from, yes, I think that what's happening here is so inflected with like the cultural dynamics of cool consumption in gentrified inner urban bar scenes in cities like this, which is a city that is, like many in the UK, is kind of known for its kind of the kind of diversity of the nighttime economy, the relationship between hospitality venues and the music scene, things like that. So there is, you know, a lot of the language that they use and things like that are really connected with that. So I acknowledge that. And that identification of who can hang and the aesthetics of that are really inflected with all the kind of taste cultures that these venues are kind of situated within. But I think that if I was doing this work in places that were a little more kind of mundane, suburban, I would still be looking at who can hang, but I would suggest that probably the relational styles required of people would be very different, but it would still be quite important to be able to do that. And in any venue, a manager is going to be looking for someone who's going to fit in and who can relate to the customers. And conceivably, if someone seems too cool, if they came from a bar like this, maybe they would actually be off-putting to, you know, some of the, you know, maybe older clientele or whatever that are drinking in places like this. So possibly the intensity and the relation and the requirement to be up in each other's faces might be less intense as well, because these venues tend to be relatively physically small but packed. And so I do think, you know, when workers talk about how important it is to be able to effortlessly manage their own corporate reality, that is also kind of part of that. So yeah, this is all really inflected with like the nature of the way that the way that interactive service labour has changed over time. But I suppose I wouldn't want to suggest that the context that you're describing are any less complex. I might have less to say about how it actually works, but I do think that it is work in which the task is cultivating relationships to a certain extent. Oh, another thing to say is that we do have some people in the project who have done things like work in large catering companies, or worked in really big venues like the MCG, like a really big footy stadium. Their work is much more. They have contracts. They get jobs through like job ads, which they apply for. They wear a uniform. Their interactions are relatively scripted. There's that kind of really formal style of service, right? Whereas the venues that these workers tend to work in require a certain air of spontaneity. Consumers don't want to feel like they're getting fake service with a smile. They want it to feel sort of real. And that's connected with, I think, like the relation, well, all the things I was talking about before. So I would suggest that possibly the need to be able to effortlessly hang is more intense when there's a requirement that you can more that you at least project the impression of authenticity in your relationships with your colleagues and your relationships with your consumers. Yeah.
Is there a premium applied to workers who have the vibe in terms of their wages?
No. There is no premium. So no, basically. So the thing about hospitality is you get paid basically the same wherever you work. The interesting thing about the industry is that since we started doing this, there has been a lot of public attention to exploitation, wage theft, things like that, which just became illegal, at least in Victoria. So I suspect under-the-table work is probably less common than it used to be. But when we did this project, our participants literally said, getting award wages is a perk, right? So they laughed at us. Yeah, many of them had never signed an employment contract. So there is no wage premium to doing almost anything in hospitality. So the reward for being able to hang is that you enjoy the work more because you're working with people that you like and they like you, and you're part of the hospo scene, and that work then isn't so terrible, because if you're not working with people you like, then hospitality sucks. It's just cleaning up after people and giving them stuff. So that's the reward. There are small differences in how much people get paid from venue to venue, but it's not like an individual worker will ever be rewarded for being able to. They get rewarded by the fact that they continue to get shifts. That's the reward. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great project. Very exciting. I think this idea of the box. Excellent. Yeah, I was just wondering, to what extent that's kind of relates to co-workers, so the ability to have, and then the buyers kind of out-facing more like customers and glad to mention earlier about actually go out to some of sort of relate that this idea of buying emotion-based, because in a sense, like you're required to be cool and exuding a certain attitude and stuff. Like, as you suggested before, like, I'm just wondering if you might, be able to play with.
Yeah. So I'll start with the emotional labour angle. So emotional labour is disciplined and alienated. That's what Hochschild really emphasises in her initial formulation of the theory, is that it is as a form of work. You are disciplining your own emotions, and you are therefore alienated from those emotions. In doing that, you are putting on a kind of performance that is a kind of deliberate, reflexive, and cynical performance in order to, create the kind of consumption experience that the airline wants you to kind of create, right? So the thing that's interesting about emotional labour is that even in emotional labour, even in Hochschild's book, the employers of those airline hostesses I was telling them, you'll do the best job if you really feel it. I want you to really feel welcoming of this person. And it's in really feeling it that you'll do the best kind of job. And so much of their training is about getting workers to, in a sense, try to lie to themselves about how they're feeling about some prick who's yelling at them on the airplane, right? So that, I think, I mean, that is always going on. And so, yeah. The kinds of venues that we're talking about here, though, one of the perks for workers is that they do not have to necessarily try to really feel it. So especially in bars where there is kind of like, if they don't want to serve you, they can just kick you out. There is the assumption that workers are not obligated to give you service with a smile, right? And so this stuff kind of kicks in a little bit more. But if you're working in a restaurant or a cafe, you do have to give service with a smile. And so that emotional labour angle, I think, kind of becomes more useful for looking at those interactions. I think that, but I would sort of, I guess I wouldn't want to make a hard and fast distinction between these kinds of venues and like mainstream kind of consumption venues, because as I said, I do think that there's a complex interplay between the notion of authenticity as something that's at stake in all interactive service interactions. It might take a particularly explicit form here, and we've theorised it for a long time here, so we're able to kind of talk about it in a particular way in these contexts, but I would kind of be resistant to kind of having a clear kind of distinction. Yeah, the key and most destructive difference, I think, is also, as I said, that this difference between cafe, restaurant and bar work, which do have really different dynamics and which require different things from people. But the thing is, even in any interaction, like if you go to a cafe or a restaurant or something, we've all had this experience where somebody serves you and afterwards it's a bit cringe because they were like too nice, you know, and they were sort of falling over themselves to fawn over you, and they're just doing their job, but it made you feel weird. You want it to feel normal. You want it to feel kind of real, at least a bit, even if you both know it's not real in the usual sense. So yeah, all that stuff I think is always at stake. Yeah. All right, I'll definitely need to finish up there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dave. I'll time myself. So I'm going to talk about, in a way that really flows on from what Dave was talking about, the ways that the vibe and the socialities that was just discussed are emphatically gendered and have a range of consequences for women and feminine people who work in the hospitality industry. So gender in interactive service labour, like through concepts of emotional labour, sexualised labour, affective labour, and aesthetic labour, all of these concepts try to take into account and really centralise the ways that gender informs the working practices of people working in the industries, and creates very particular kinds of demands in terms of the vibes that workers are encouraged, but also in many ways required to bring or expected to bring by virtue of the bodies that they inhabit. They're coded in gendered and sexualised ways, which then mean there are particular capacities or expectations that are required in their jobs. Sexual harassment is also known to be extremely widespread in the industry, and there's been a range of recent reports documenting that. And what we're going to, Megan and I are leading a report at the moment, which is going to be about the qualitative experiences of gender and sexual harassment and violence in the hospitality industry, because there's a lot of statistics, there's surveys being done, but there's, aside from the reports and the news articles that come out, there's very little qualitative detail. So I'm going to go through some of that today. So basically, as I was already saying, the demands of physical presentation, sense of humour, receptivity, being personable, having a positive attitude, there are so many different sort of capacities or qualities that are gendered that operate in this space. And as feminist labour studies theorists have shown for a number of decades, the processes of this labour mobilise the broader politics of heterosexual desire. They also go beyond that, as Megan will discuss in her talk in a little while. But that's sort of, I guess, the broad premise of the ways that labour operates in this space, and it happens in a range of complex ways. So all the kind of bodily comportment strategies undertaken in an effort to look right are critical in producing the sensation of feeling right, or creating the vibe, as Dave was talking about, which establishments hope to create in the bodies of consumers and which they require of their workers. And I'd say regardless of the spaces. So there was sort of a bit of a distinction in some of the questions and in Dave's presentations about the particular spaces of the inner city and things, but I think the kind of the grind of femininity work operates regardless of where you're working. But then there are additional demands depending on kind of the level of hipness or the space. So, yeah, hopefully we can keep having this kind of conversations. It's one of the ones we, as a team, have had quite a lot about those distinctions between the different forms of work and labour required. So, basically, creating a good vibe is one of the, I guess, responsibilities of women workers in particular. So, of course, the men workers also were required to do this through their practices, but what it would look like obviously would be gendered depending on the worker. So Catherine talked about, making an effort to have heaps of fun with a customer to make sure they're not losing their buzz when they come off the dance floor in a pub or in a bar. It's something she just does. It's just something she knows how to do, is how to kind of interact or relate to kind of create that feeling of happiness or fun in somebody. And Karen talked about, and other participants talked about, how flirting and through kind of having that sort of, the sexual atmosphere of the bar is something they enjoyed participating in, and that was very much their job to enhance that. They were most of the time happy to do that. Because it was, if it was a pleasurable or enjoyable interaction, then it was a nice thing for both parties. But this obviously created a context which was difficult to navigate a lot of the time. So there was sort of this paradox where they were required to comport in this flirty, relatable, very personable, eye contacty type of way. But then that sort of meant that they were also having to always navigate and having to deal with the consequences when other people crossed the line. So, the lusty drunk vibe is obviously a quote that we really loved in the project. It's part of working in the bar, that's cool. But then there is a very clear line. So, often in the reports, the industry things we've been reading, there's sort of this tendency to be like, oh, it's so hard to know, like when people, it's so hard to know when workers cross the line or when patrons do, because it's this sexualised environment, whereas participants are like, is a clear line. It's not a difficult line. It's just, if you're being disrespectful, if you're being objectively, rude or talking about things that you want to do with the worker while they're at work, that's clearly wrong. There's nothing kind of grey about that. So obviously, yeah, so there are clear lines of inappropriateness, and I think that often gets excused or folded into, that kind of sexualised environment, which also plays into all kinds of, again, dominant gendered stereotypes or narratives of which it can be very blaming of victims. So Catherine, again, will be talking about, just the labour of managing sexual harassment as very much part of the same labour of managing the vibe. So it would just be so kind of commonplace that would just often give very specific or often very general examples too about just, the quiet butt grabber or the leg stroker, and just how it would, anytime you're moving through a busy, crowded space, there'd be hands grabbing. And they also talked about, in some venues, Catherine was also a manager of the bar she worked in, really enjoying this sort of strange, I guess, liminal space that the bar can have, where at the same time you're at work, you have to manage all these complex vibe relations. But you're also in this sort of strange liminal space of being able to call someone out because you're in public, because you can sort of call on the structures or the context of being at work, and that there being a distinction between you as the worker and the customer that you can actually call upon to, publicly shame someone and say, march them out of there in front of all their friends, which Catherine really enjoyed doing. So sexual harassment, obviously endemic and is one aspect, but the requirement to manage aggression is, I think, it's aligned but qualitatively different prospect, very much connected to the sexualised politics of bar work in particular. But yeah, as part of that same thing of calling out problematic customers for sexual harassment and for wanting, and women bar workers in particular, wanting to make sure the spaces they were working in were safe for patrons as well as for their co-workers, women were then often positioned by themselves and by their colleagues as being the most suitable people for the job to de-escalate a potentially violent situation. They were, so Felicity, for example, said if someone's looking for a fight, in for a bit of argy, the worst thing you can do is send a male bar member to deal with them because they're going to want to flog them, whereas women can de-escalate the situation far better. And as Stan also said, some guys just want to kick off and start a fight over anything. You can be their buddy, try to get on their side, but those guys they'll just be like, I'm not your mate, and then they'll just go boom, it doesn't matter what you do, you're pretty much fucked, unless you're a female staff member, because they're not generally open to punching females depending on the individual though. There's so much going on in that quote. There's the dynamics of male sociality which make it more dangerous for men to kind of enter that interaction or that relation. And then therefore women who are outside of that relation, as it's described here, are sort of seen as being the safer option by virtue of just not being a man. But of course, you know, these kinds of things were discussed after hearing all of those examples about, you know, the butt grabber and the leg stroke, all those kinds of dynamics of sexual harassment. So then to then be responsible for being the one to diffuse this situation, we just thought was so sort of confounding and problematic, yet it was described as being so strategic and just sort of another of those invisibilised requirements that just was seen to be just the natural kind of solution as it was presented to us. But of course, women are not outside of those relations. They're very much inside of the relations of masculine aggression when it comes to heterosexual politics. It's just that being in the public space sometimes was, I guess, positioned as being separate from, but as any feminist or gender studies scholar or literature will tell you, those things are not really separate. The private-public distinction are very much aligned and flow into each other. So we're really interested in looking at the, I guess, the femininity work that is required in this and the ways those kind of feminine norms and broader gendered norms create this context, which is so problematic for workers. So Jenny talked about, you know, getting in between male patrons who were arcing up and causing aggro, and that, you know, the element of surprise worked really well because they weren't expecting a small, you know, diminutive woman to be in between. And the premise again is that men won't hit a woman in public anyway, is always kind of the silent bit. But of course they do. And the even though the kind of gendered norm of masculinity is that men don't want to be seen to do this in public, there are, of course, the exceptions. And I'll talk about this in a moment. I also want to kind of make note of, again, the particular venues we were looking at here is the ones that the kind of inner city, more boutique style small venues, which would deliberately not have security because they were trying to preserve the vibe of being generally smiley and happy and that kind of horizontal, non-hierarchical, we're all equal kind of egalitarian vibe. But that would also, we think, kind of put the labour, additional labour of security onto the women often. So that those kind of dynamics and how they intersect with class atmospheric dimensions is, I think, really significant. So there are, of course, a number of ways in which the situations did develop to become very unsafe and very, you know, actual violence for some of the participants. So women described that, you know, this required them to develop an intuition for when not to go in. There was this sort of weird, again, vibe that they talked about with just being able to tell if someone doesn't give a shit, if they're that guy who will just go anyone. Like Stan said earlier on, most guys, depending on the guy, there's sort of always this qualified statement, right? And of course, that one is always the one you have to really worry about. Whereas, of course, as a gender and sociology scholar, I would say that, the gendered dynamics of this whole arrangement are completely problematic and completely effed. So it's all part of that broader continuum that's the problem. And Felicity, who, was one of the ones who really enjoyed kicking people out, was also a manager from Newcastle, incidentally, has talked about, again, the occasional guys who are actual pieces of shit. And, she had consistent rape threats over a period of months, had to call the police. And again, it's kind of always the exception that proves the rule, right? And proves what the actual context is. So this kind of broader gendered context where women are impelled to diffuse confrontations and sort of, they did enjoy kicking out problematic patrons, but the gendered context that's going on in this is so profoundly problematic and is representative of the broader nighttime economy in general. And it sort of hasn't been documented the ways that women bar workers themselves are acting as security. There's a lot of studies about security in the nighttime economy, about women bouncers, and about bystander intervention programs where bartenders are sort of trained to help patrons. And those kind of studies sometimes talk about the gender dynamics of this, but the positioning of women workers being at work and being required to manage this is kind of an entirely different, related but really significant prospect. So, obviously, the gender norms, such as the assumption that women are more adept at more complex and interpersonal management tasks, as labour studies theorists have been showing for a long time through emotional labour and other theories, are invoked to explain why women are called on to be just better suited to. There's all kinds of naturalised gendered femininity things going on there. But these gendered expectations create such a noxious environment for women bar workers, and I think it's a real concern that should be on the agenda when we're looking at the broader dynamics of sexual violence in society. We're looking at it in universities, in all kinds of different contexts at the moment. So I think Megan and I and the team are hoping that the report we're producing on the basis of some of this work will, I guess, contribute to the discussions that are already happening in this space, to really look at this as a product of gendered inequalities and the gendered harms rather than a naturalised or expected invisibilised practice for women workers. I'll leave it there. I have already said that. Okay. Just getting the mic set up for questions. If you've got them on the Zoom, you can put them in the chat, please.
Hi, Julia. My name's Hannah from UTS. Great research, very interesting. I think it's just so fascinating in stories of participants as well as women, just in those kind of situations. But I was very curious to hear, sort of like, okay, what's the intervention strategies? What can actually be done? What's the role of management in this situation? So I guess I'm kind of interested to hear what might be that next phase of your work and what you think might be some of the ways you can actually be dealing with some of these really concerning issues that you raised in your research.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're coming up with some recommendations at the moment. One of, I guess, some of the venues where we see the participants talk about, I guess, the normative presence of harassment and violence, but there being someone to rely on or to talk to who can deal with it for you, who's not you having to deal with that. I think having some kind of management structure is really useful. It doesn't have to be security. Security can be problematic as well for a whole range of other gendered reasons. But having, I guess, a clear, realistic understanding that venues have of the gendered heterosexual politics of the nighttime economy, and that needing to be managed, and the fact that your venue operates in that sphere means that you need to be aware of it. So having all kinds of strategies around how to deal with that, I think, is a really important one. That would depend obviously on the venue. We're not going to be sort of creating a policy on this as such, but it would be good to work with people who are good at doing that kind of work. It's not my specialty, but I know that is already happening in some places. Workers just want to be safe at work. So I think there's a whole lot of ways that we can tie in that message with just a baseline kind of safety message, and that's a right. It's a worker's right to be safe. I think at the moment it's happening in, as I said, with the broader kind of awareness of sexual violence and violence as a societal issue. That conversation is already happening. So I think trying to engage the people, the venues, all the businesses who are sort of operating in the centre of that. We talk about the workers, their experiences, we talk about gendered violence and the structural norms out here. There's so many players in the middle, and I think recognising it as a problem for men rather than a problem for women to have to manage. So I think that's kind of how, if I was trying to talk to venues, I would be trying to position it in that way rather than, again, making women safe, responsible for keeping themselves and others safe. So obviously, Bianca Fileborn obviously is doing great work in this in Melbourne, in the kind of broader bystander intervention program stuff in music festivals, and using the same gender dynamics to look at it. Thanks.
Right.
Great stuff, Julia. Obviously very close to the project, but outside of that, I do stuff.
Of course.
Prevention. I can see very strong links in this report with what's happened with the Respect at Work Act.
Yes.
Industrial relations in Australia. So I would love to see how that can be strengthened in what you're doing here again. I had like 10 things that I would love to talk to you about afterwards.
Sure.
But I guess the question that I have is about the note that you said regarding some of the participants enjoying kicking out punches who have been problematic, and whether or not you thought that was about bringing back the good vibe.
I think reading the transcripts, the feeling of it came from kind of enacting some kind of justice. Actually, it was like kind of being a kind of feminist warrior was very much the thing that they got to perform or play that role in, because that kind of role is not possible on the street. But again, it's such a particular space that they're in, and so I wouldn't at all want to kind of claim that as some kind of empowering or like transcending kind of experience where they get to be outside of all these relations and kind of win. I think it's a very brief, fleeting moment of some kind of feeling of victory, but that is very, again, tenuous, qualified, specific to that moment and to that particular role, and also relying on hoping that as soon as they don't step outside, someone's not going to be waiting for them around the corner.
Looking back on my own working life, I'm trying to think of one of the difficulties that I think the gig economy throws up is the whole idea of how do you write a position description for a job that requires the vibe and to hang and to be able to deal with problem patrons. So I guess this is more a comment than a question, but it seems to me that whole informality of the gig economy throws up all of these problems. Yeah.
I completely agree. I think that having to kind of individually strategise these things between co-workers, and just that means that you then have to rely on the existing gender dynamics and have to try to strategically make them work in the most pragmatic way that keeps the most number of people safe, which is what's happening here. So those individualised strategies are, of course, profoundly problematic and rely on those dynamics and inequalities. So, yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, we'll move on to you.
Hi everyone, thank you. The screen, I'm not tall enough to be in front of that screen. So, okay. All right, I'll talk through this gap. Okay, thanks everyone. I also want to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Awabakal people of the Pamalong clan and that sovereignty has never been ceded. So I'm hoping today with my presentation that I can bring together some of Dave's work. Thank you as well, both of you, for those presentations. Dave's work, particularly around this comment here about emotional labour and affective labour and immaterial labour through the experiences of the queer workers who, of which there were a lot of queer participants within this broader study. My slides look a little bit different, but hopefully that I'm just queering the paradigm. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is this assumption that queer people work in either queer bars, that they don't work in mainstream hospitality venues, which our research kind of challenged because lots of queer folk do work in mainstream hospitality bars. But the second thing also, this, and I think this question you asked about emotional labour, hopefully this kind of gives some context about the difference between, or the extension to Hochschild's work, because these workers really draw on their biographies of being queer to produce value in the service economy, particularly in Melbourne, where being queer and aesthetics of queerness, music, sound, fashion, bodily comportment, all of these things are they're signals of diversity. And in a city like Melbourne, those things are very important and quite valuable. So generally, as kind of Julia's presentation showed us, the logics of hospitality work are heterosexual. The system itself and how the industry operates is through a heterosexual one. Men usually desire women. Women are usually expected to make themselves desirable to men. That's broadly how all hospitality works. Any literature that has come out on queer people generally thinks about queer folk as needing to be included. That there is a heterosexual framework, an industry, and that we need to find ways to include queer people into this network, into this industry. And this means that queer people are usually approached as in deficit. That heterosexuality is public. We publicise heterosexuality and make it a consumption experience. But for queer folk, that's a private thing that happens. You know, that's something that we have in our bedrooms or in our homes. We don't take it to work with us. And this work really challenges that kind of idea because for our queer hospitality workers, they found that their sexuality was very important and actually gave them, it was one of the instruments that they used, much like Dave was talking about, how to be yourself at work, how to hang, right? Can our queerness help us hang? So, yeah, a lot of the research that's about queer people at work is not specific to any particular workplace, it's or any industry. It's very much just about work. And most stuff about queer people at work, if it's really about their queerness, is about them working in gay bars or in bathhouses. So it's very much like sex-centred rather than being about queerness as like a social location. So queer workers in our study are often relied upon to provide a diverse consumption experience that reflects an inclusive vibe. So venues are more likely to hire queer workers when they have ideas about the kinds of patronage they want, where that patronage is going to be diverse and inclusive itself, right? And they use these terms, diverse and inclusive. So they want queer people to come to their bar. They want to basically like tick the boxes of what they understand to be an intersectional approach to hiring and to consumption. So make sure you have someone who's Indigenous, someone who's a person of colour, make sure you have someone who can call themselves queer, make sure all of this is visible so that we look like we're doing the work of diversity, which will make people want to come and spend money in our bar. The vibe is usually progressive, usually left-leaning, and known to be tolerant, right? And these vibes project onto a queer community that there's a space of safety, that these people can engage with, that the queer community can engage with, that they have access, and that this is a place where queer consumption isn't necessarily just you know, it's not tokenistic. This is a real authentic place where queer people can kind of come together. But interestingly, most of our participants who worked in mainstream bars who were queer said there's nothing really authentic about it. It's all just a very effortfully curated experience and the worker gets hugely exploited because the only queerness in this place is drawn from the biography of the worker themselves. It is not about having any kind of, they're not reimbursed for any of this work or remunerated for any of this work. They're not paid anymore. Then, yeah, there's no protection for their safety either. It also offers heterosexual people and cis people the opportunity to do allyship. So a lot of our participants talked about how they feel like cis and hetero people can come to a bar and have, you know, a cocktail with their flamboyant bartender and talk shit and be like, I'm in this cool, hip, urban place and I've got this like amazing queer bartender and I'm like doing allyship. This makes me feel good because I'm giving them my money, right? I'm like participating in the tolerant consumption. In this way, queer workers in mainstream hospitality venues are enrolled into specific modes of interactive service labour that capitalises on their queer biography. So they're not alienated from their work, really. They're not alienated from themselves. In fact, they're asked to draw out as much of themselves as they possibly can, but in the limits of respectability politics. So don't be radical. Don't go too far with your queerness. Make sure it's palatable and that straight and cis people will still like you and still want to come here. But be queer enough that you're fun and you like to party and you make the allies feel good about themselves, right? So queer workers were expected by managers, co-workers and clientele to align their expressions of gender and sexuality with heterosexual values. And this kind of speaks to the sociality that Dave was talking about, like how people's kind of understand their bodies moving within the values of the industry, the hospitality industry itself. Again, with Julia's work around violence, speaks to queer people reading violence in a way that is heterosexual. So lots of the participants talked about the queer participants talked about the types of violence that they encounter being very different to the heterosexual people. You know, they get asked about their gender, have they had their surgery yet? For our trans participants was a really common one. And they see this as a kind of violence, but there's no space to call that out, right? The violence that happens in a lot of hospitality venues is read only through a heterosexual kind of lens. So in this way, queerness is regulated by a broader politics of respectability. And even Ros Ward's work about respectability politics in queer organisations still talks about how these respectability politics are still ones that are based in a middle class kind of understanding. Poor and marginalised queer people's experience of the world aren't really accounted for, even when venues are supposed to be queer themselves. So the example I raised in the paper that we wrote together was trans women's experiences in Irving's study, which some of our participants talked about in the latter stages of this data collection, where because their femininity didn't necessarily cohere with what we would typically assume or traditionally assume to be a feminine embodiment or a feminine experience, they were seen to be not as competent. They often found it difficult to get jobs in hospitality because their femininity didn't kind of neatly map onto how we understand femininity. And they also felt like if they made a mistake, that was because their femininity wasn't proper. You know, they didn't have the right kind of femininity. And that was really a reflection on their transness, not necessarily their ability as a worker themselves. So this is Ben. Ben's a Newcastle employee. He works in a kind of regional cafe, looking to be hip and cool, but ultimately just serves like a 9-to-5 worker clientele. Ben kind of talks about how lots of employers, if you're looking to be, if the venue is looking to be considered tolerant, if it's looking to be diverse, they want you to be as queer as you can be overt, be fun, be flamboyant, make sure everyone knows that you're a gay boy. Really kind of put that on, bring that out in yourself. And Ben talks about how that's actually really hard to do all the time, to have that on all the time. And, you know, he really wants to be, a good barista. He's happy with his job. In fact, he talks about how he could do any number of different jobs. He has a university degree, but he just kind of wants to work in the cafe because he wants to be able to be chill. He just wants to be in a place where he can kind of relax and get to know people. But there's often demands made upon him that make him feel like that isn't, that he can't really do that. But yeah, he talks about how you're supposed to be a flaming homosexual and you're expected to play that up all the time. The other thing that Ben talked about was this, you know, the ticking of the boxes, making sure that, you know, these venues make sure that they have everyone ticked off so that they can have a public-facing diversity kind of face, window dressing, a lot of them call it. This is Ryan. Ryan talks about being gay. A lot of the participants talked about this, much like what Julia's work says around gender and violence, like this intuition. A lot of the queer participants call it a scope. They've got a broader scope for understanding the consumer, being able to read potential tension, identifying homophobia and transphobia even before it comes up, to like cultivate that vibe that is kind of safe, because they want their community to be safe. They work in these places where, you know, potentially queer people will be coming in. It's not just about keeping the venue without violence. It's also about being a kind of an advocate for your own queer community while you're there. You want to protect the people who've come to consume in your venue. And Ryan's case, he talks about his biography as a gay man and having to hide a lot of his gayness, but, you know, being really attuned to homophobia in his life because of the fact that he spent so long being inside of his own head, and he really draws on that in his work. But he also says it's a bit of a curse because he imagines that when he's working with all the straight guys and they're kind of not very nice to him, he goes, oh, is that because I'm gay? So it's a very dual kind of position that he's in. Yeah, constantly being like, what have I done to this person? Is this just because I'm gay? You know, is that why people are acting up around me? Because he does do a little bit of managerial work. And my last quote is about this relationship between visibility and education. So workers who said, you know, I'm expected to be really queer. I come in, I look queer, I make people feel like they're part of a really urban, hip, trendy, fun place to be. But that also puts me in a position where I need to become like an educator for the public. So Ash is a good example of someone coming to the bar and you know, because Ash looks very queer and is a non-binary person, kind of means that everyone who comes into the bar is like, oh, I just want to talk to you about queer politics. You look so queer. Like, let's have a discussion about the new, you know, Judith Butler book. And Ash is like, I just can't today. Like, this is my work. Ben also talked about this, about being the barista in the regional town, which I think is interesting about your comment about regional kind of rural places. Ben talks about how he transitioned, and because these customers had been going to this cafe for like 10 years, they've kind of watched Ben transition, and now their own children might be questioning their gender or their sexuality, and Ben has become like the resident kind of queer advocate or educator, and everyone comes in and goes, oh, you know, can you, while you're making my latte, can you just tell me about the difference between sex and gender and how they're connected to each other? And Ben's like, I really am not getting paid for the lecture, and also there's 10 people waiting. So yeah, so they become like the educator on this. And I think a lot of our participants talked about this, but visibility was also really important, particularly through the pandemic and masking. How do queer people in hospitality working face-to-face signal to other people that they are queer? One of our participants talked about how when she had to wear a mask and she wanted everyone to know she was bisexual, she put a little shave in her eyebrow so that when people came in, they could tell that she was bisexual, and that was like her telegraphing that, you know, I'm here and I'm queer. We could read that on her, which I thought was also like, that there is a lot of kind of aesthetics, which Steve and Lena will talk about next. So I will wrap up, but basically the paper that we've written, which I do have on the next slide, argues that, again, all of this stuff about affect and emotional labour and immaterial labour is not just necessarily carried in on the bodies of the people who work in these places. They're actually really, it's really cultivated, it's really effortful. There's a lot of labour that goes into it. And on top of that, you have to actually be quite skilled at being a hospitality worker, which, you know, traditionally we've understood to be unskilled. So there's a lot of a lot of labour going on in these roles, particularly where we're seeing, you know, increased gentrification and the kind of weight of diversity politics being used in a capitalist framework to produce certain values. So being included at work is more than simply overcoming homophobia, being treated equally. Actually, you know, there is like an experience that is producing value, producing knowledge as well. And the workers do a lot of things. They're enacting and contesting heteronormativity, homonormativity, the politics of diversity and inclusions with their co-workers and with their customers. And this is the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Do we have some questions? Brennan.
Thanks, Megan. I like that. That was great, as colourful as the slides. Did any of the participants name this up as like exploitation? Like,
Yes, they know they're being exploited. Yes, they know they're being exploited.
And how did that make them feel?
It made them feel like they were being exploited. You know, it's really funny because a lot of them had a lot of resistance to it. Like, I mean, I guess particularly in Melbourne, no, I would say in Newcastle as well, there was a lot of like, we know we're being exploited, so we do other things in these venues to kind of recoup what we're spending. Like, for example, if our friends come in, like if the queers come in, we'll give everyone free shots and stuff. Like they find kind of sneaky ways if they're being exploited to pay it forward to the maybe the queer folk who are coming in. But no, I mean, largely it's hopeless to think that you're going to get paid any more money or that you could go anywhere else and expect any better treatment. There's a few kind of queer venues where people are looking to work at, like they're looking to get into those places, but there's so few specifically queer places you can work anymore that everyone's banging on the door to get in.
Any more questions for me? Thanks.
Yay.
Okay.
Oh, it's not going to have the thing on it. All right,
yeah.
We can just. Cool.
Okay, so Lena and I are the last paper in our session here, and we're going to talk about aspects of aesthetics and tastes. You'll see from our paper that it's very much a work in progress. We're working through data here to come up with some things, to come up with a paper in the future. about this. You can always tell when slides are really busy, like ours are going to be, that we're still working through it.
Hopefully there's some good goss though.
Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about aspects of class, but not class specifically, really. So I think the way to think about class and the way that we're talking about it in this paper is more about what the venues are trying to do rather than the workers in them, because we don't really have specific data, whether a worker's working class or middle class or that too much. It's more about the people coming into these spaces, doing this hospitality work and kind of enacting the performativity of what's required in that space. So really the way I want class to be thought about, and this has been written up in a paper that I've written already with colleagues, is kind of class is made in these spaces through the relationality going on between the people, but also between what the venue's trying to do and the practices that go on in that space. We've touched upon kind of the background already, but like some of the workers we're talking about in here refer to themselves as lifers. They're the ones that kind of thought maybe they were going to get into hospitality, work there for a while and move on to something else. And the lifer term has jail connotations deliberately. And also why people are working in these spaces. There's obviously financial imperatives and creating a good vibe, but as we've discussed already, there's performing one's politics is happening in these spaces, but also in the work that kind of I'm interested, particularly the way that these spaces resonate with music scenes and stuff like that. So workers often in the inner north, for instance, will be in bands, they'll be serving people in other bands, and there's a kind of sociality and almost networking going on around that kind of stuff. So we're just going to kind of go through some what we think are interesting quotes from our participants. But I suppose, I'm not going to theorise too much, but you can see throughout the quotes we're about to kind of discuss here, there's a whole bunch of blurriness between work and leisure, between production and consumption. There's the way that identity is kind of enrolled into working, and particularly the way that I think what we're finding is that what we would maybe define as good bar workers are particularly reflexive about their venue, their place in it, and what they need to do to be a kind of good bar worker. So the first quote here, and in this double act, we've kind of worked out what we're going to do, but our notes aren't there. Yeah. Good bar workers tend to be quite reflexive about their venue. So we have Helen here, who's a long-term hospitality worker. She also works a little bit in kind of social work realm too, that'll come into importance in a minute. So she talks about, people here, they're responsive to trends. We've got this blue drink. It's a very Instagrammable place. The blue drink comes back later in the presentation. Instagram chefs. There are lots of people that she would call South Side type people, city people, suits older people. This place is in the inner north, so that's kind of a rarity. She says this place kind of scares people. They don't feel comfortable here because of how trendy it is. So you can see here Helen kind of has a pretty good understanding of what the hospitality scene is, who goes where, and how this place fits in. She also talks, and we're going to talk about Helen quite a little bit in this talk, how the venue that she works in is there to build a community. Now, this is a quite idiosyncratic venue in a way because it's part of a large arts precinct. I need to describe it in a way to kind of keep its anonymity, but it's built in this kind of, developing what I would call gentrifying arts precinct that literally if you stand out the front, you can see the kind of housing commission across the road, even though it's in the kind of gentrifying inner north. So Helen talks about how at this, they're trying to build this community around this kind of art practices. It was this place that she's working in very much to serve this community. But she also points out that it doesn't really serve the suburb. There's a kind of real tension between that.
Other participants talked about community with regard to the customer base and how they were reflexive to the location and who they were serving. So Alex here works in a venue that is really responsive and tries to include people from the local area in the venue and be adaptive to their needs. And so we can see this quote here. I've had so many friends come in there who are part of the local LGBTQI+ community who are like, this is awesome. And they are really aware of the needs of their community and of themselves in the place that they work. So there's a contrast here in what community needs
are in the venue and how they engage with that, and also what the venue is doing in response to community requirements or what that might look like.
That's right, yeah. Should have pointed out too, all the photos in here are photos that we took on our ethnographies, so that'll come up a little bit more as well. So, as Helen points out, while they might be building community around this kind of arts practice space, she points out that there's a real juxtaposition in that sense between the actual community who's living quite close to this venue. So she says you can't shy away from that fact. You know, it's next to the flats, next to the flats, next to the tape. The tenants over there, you know, tenants in this kind of space, the not-for-profits, subsidise the rent and all this kind of stuff's going on to build a community in one respect. But really, you know, as she goes through this quote, she's pointing out that it doesn't really kind of serve the people around them, and they're trying to think about ways to integrate the young people in this kind of three, you know, low SES, but yet gentrifying suburbs around the space. She says, I think it's like a tugging, a pushing and pulling, where a community trying to be for the community, but then there's the community. And she kind of emphasises it in that last use of the word community.
So what this brings us to is why young people are brought in to work in places and in particular kinds of places. And in this iteration of the project, I've been doing the interview, so I'm very close to this data. And quite a few of them, participants said, well, you know, I can't afford to eat here. And so there's a really brilliant rich quote here from Sydney who said, we're so overpriced and, you know, it's not worth $200 a head. And I didn't even enjoy the food here. I came here before I worked at the place. I'm a bartender. I was sponsored by Jägermeister, all this stuff. She's really proud of her work. Also, Sydney was quitting that, like she had quit a couple of weeks before and it was the last day of her shift, her last shift on the job. So she was really excited to tell me a whole bunch of stuff. And, but yeah, she said when she came to try the trial at the venue sponsored by Jägermeister, she remembered not even enjoying the food and she wasn't even paying for it. But at the same time, she points out that she's not the right demographic. They're going for someone else at this particular venue. And similarly, other participants have said, well, I can't afford to eat out much all the time, so I don't even do it that much. So when I've asked participants, is this the kind of place that you would come to eat at? Many have said flat out no, because they don't go out to eat at or they don't relate to the customers that they're serving. But they do relate to their colleagues. They hang out with them, they have made friendships with them, but they go elsewhere or they just don't eat out that much. And Farhana down here says, with respect to her venue, which is a cafe in a beautiful location on the beach, that she would just prefer to make her own sandwiches and sit at the beach because she personally felt that it's overpriced.
Yeah, so I think this kind of points out that like, the young people working in these places can fit in symbolically and kind of fit all the vibe, but like obviously not so much economically. But also there's this thing, particularly I think in reality TV and stuff like that, about how to be a good worker and to be a good chef, you've got to be a good consumer. And we can see here that that's kind of only can really be the case for some, particularly if you're working in a fairly pricey venue. So, apologise by the ridiculous amount of text on this screen, but I really like this this story. So I'll just, rather than read the quote, I'll just kind of tell the story here. This is Helen, who you know, was very invested in her work, but also is a very Melbourne person who wears black, you know, like most Melbourne people do. Yeah, and you know, gets a very short notice that at this special event, it's the Jägermeister event that we've already spoke about, that she has to wear block colours. Now, there are block colours up there. I didn't know what they were until I Googled it. So she says, you know, this is a real imposition on her, right? Short notice. Notice she has to go and buy her clothes to do this. They're not provided. So, you know, she's subsidising the job in this kind of already fairly poorly paid job. Look at me. I live in Northcote. I wear black constantly. I was having a conniption about this. I want to feel good. I want to look hot. So she doesn't get to be herself in this. So obviously here this speaks to notions of authenticity, about the way her identity in this venue was normally valued. But in this instance, this kind of a moment, you know, a kind of hysteresis moment really where it's all turned around and she has to kind of be someone else. She doesn't like it. This is literally just for the aesthetic and not for actual protection. She's talking about the clothes. It's like cosplaying hospitality. which I did not like. So I think that's a really interesting quote in terms of the formativity, emotional labour stuff. That's kind of the norm for thinking about working in hospitality. And the cosplaying thing comes back in a minute. We'll talk about that in a different way. So, you know, this, all of a sudden this honcho comes down and tells that she's not doing it right or whatever, and she just basically tells them to fuck off, to step off. You know, don't talk to us about this. You've already made us wear these dodgy clothes. Sorry, it's not us. So there's a real kind of connection between the way she feels about working in this place, how it is normally, and how the kind of goalposts have been changed in this situation.
So some people that we've spoken to, however, don't necessarily want to be themselves at work. We talked to Mira, who on the day that I spoke with her said that I look like a homeless person with a messy bun today. So when I work in hospitality, I'm like, yeah, I can have a unique style. Maybe I'll try a winged eyeliner or something. So yeah, Mira works as a booth hostess at a venue on the south side of Melbourne. And so she'll work on the floor and to try to dance with someone and have a little boogie with them and talk to them about things like such as her cultural background and have nice small talks with them. She brings a different side of herself to work that she doesn't necessarily do in her social life. She's told me that she's more interested in hanging out in North Fitzroy, that sort of place. But when she's at work, she'll get dressed up and those are her work clothes. It's not a uniform, but it's stuff that she wears at work. And it brings a style to work that she otherwise doesn't get to play with.
Yeah. And the hostess role, I think, is a particularly interesting one in this kind of industry, right? It's very much open to all the things that Julia was talking about in terms of the crossing the line. The job itself seems to be about like being at the line, right? Being flirtatious, being hosty, all that kind of stuff. But it also then seems to have kind of allows the position to be more social in a way because it's not this kind of serving relationship as much, even though it's in there as well. So yeah, we're still trying to think through this, but like when it comes to ethnicity in the project, which is, we've asked Lena to kind of specifically recruit for that in the second half of the project because our initial cohort was so white. You get a lot of the very usual and expected, kind of racist discrimination that goes on in this sector. But here, Mira kind of talks a little bit about like her kind of Indian bisexuality being something that people appreciate in this role, that they want to talk to her about it. She doesn't mind it because it's just kind of, it's not insulting, it's not offending. It's
in fact, she's curious about where people come from as well, and it's part of her role in talking to people.
Yeah, that's right. So I think these two examples of the cosplaying and of the kind of the one having a conniption and the one that's kind of can be playful with it are an interesting way of thinking about the performativity that goes on in these spaces. Okay.
So part of what we've been looking at and what's come out of the photo elicitation in this project is how workers work through taste. And so talking about some of the venues that other participants have worked in and looking at photos of them, participants in our study have looked at photos of these places and felt a pressure to be cool. So certain venues have brought out an aesthetic either in the workers or in the venue itself and how it presents itself, a pressure either to be cool or in other places alleviate pressure. So Chelsea, who is 18 and has been working in hospitality just a couple of years, said, I think that they would expect a certain type of down-to-earth, friendly, professional, but also cool kind of customer service. So we can see this both in the sociality and effective relations that are brought out between workers, but also in the vibe that is promoted in the choice of aesthetics. Another interviewee, Zoe, said that she would feel like it's very intense, this feeling. What if I say the wrong thing? I'm just going to get fired on the spot, because she's not from that area and she would have to be interesting. Looking at another venue, that pressure was alleviated, but based purely off of looking at what the venue looked like. It looked like a rural town pub, and even though the pub itself was in the city. You can only see one staff person there, and you can get a good amount of freedom in that kind of environment. So aesthetic choices of a venue can also provide a a sense of progressive politics. So, and this can bring something else out of a worker and what they might want to bring to the space in their choice, whether or not they choose to work in a place, and what they think would be required to work there. So we heard from on the quotes on the previous slide what they thought would be required or what they could bring. And here there's also an attachment to politics. So Asher here speaks to the weird art on the walls in one venue that we looked at, that if you're supporting local artists, you shouldn't just be supporting the ones that are straight and white. Can you please be nice to me? Can you be nice to me, please? At this sort of place, I would be a bit more like, it's 2022, we're in a really modern place. You're not just here because you want to watch two muscly men throw a ball at each other. There are also aesthetics of solidarity. So Sydney said, a place like this looks very artsy, and usually artsy hipsters are nice. We'll see about that. To which I asked, like, what do you mean by that? You said artsy hipsters are nice. And she said they read The Guardian and everything like that. They usually like the fight of the working man. No comment.
So, yeah, I think this is really interesting to think about. Like, we're talking a lot about the people working in these spaces, but it's not just the people that promotes the vibe or creates the vibe. It's also the aesthetic of the place, the things on the walls, the brands and all that kind of stuff. So we need to dive into that, I think, a little bit more.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to talk about a lot more in this project were toilets. But my team members weren't as keen as me. But
it also seems like the interviewees weren't that keen.
Yeah. So you go to a punk venue and the graffiti on the wall, there's piss and water everywhere. Like, it's just totally accepted, right? Like, you go next door to a cafe, it's not so much. So that, these aesthetics, the smells, the senses are really important to kind of create this vibe as well. Okay, so this is a good story as well, I think. The harassing wine mums, they aren't the wine mums in the photo, I promise. This is Alex, who's non-binary, is talking about kind of harassment. So Lena asks, how do you find dealing with the customers that tend to come into this place? Mostly it's pretty easy, but it's definitely there's a wine mum vibe to it sometimes, which is definitely rowdier, bottles or bubbles, geez, that's a long night. What are typically things that happen when the wine mums start to get pissed? Stuff around like gender stuff, sexuality, more openly homophobic a lot of the time, which is not super comfortable. Hitting on bar staff and stuff like that. It's harassment. When they worked at the more LGBT-centric vibe bar, similar issues, but just from, different type of person. So overall, the conclusion here is maybe middle-aged white people is generally the type who are going to be gross to bar staff. So this kind of relationality is really important, I think, for thinking about the vibe stuff that we're talking about. It obviously has all the kind of gender, sexuality stuff in it. But in the paper that we previously wrote, class was really an issue here as well, particularly when it came to workers judging who was going to be a problem and, how to kick them out and stuff like that. It was often enacted through what looked to me like very working class stereotypes.
So, one big happy family. I felt like this quote would really bring a lot of the previous papers, but also this paper together quite well. Tara, who's someone I interviewed a couple of months ago now, talked about how she's seen a lot of advertisements and job posts try to bring in the vibe through talking about how at their venue they're one big happy family. But hospitality is also a place that gets young people or workers who are in a kind of vulnerable situation and can create vulnerable situations as well. Her feeling is that if there's no overarching structure, then she's a little bit like, So she'll start to ask of a family-owned or a non-hierarchical business, for example, if there's a problem going on, is there a dedicated person that can help with that problem? And I think this links really clearly with Julia and Megan's paper on violence and conflict. So I asked that because she was currently working for a small family-owned business that was run by a friend of hers, whether or not there was currently enough systems in place. And she was saying that because the business had just opened, she didn't want to badmouth it. And this is very, very common in our interviews. Participants didn't want to badmouth places that they were currently working in. They were happy to shit talk their previous employers, and they felt like it was only when you had left a bad job that you could realise when you were in a good one, or when you were in a good job, you realise you had previously been in a bad one. But she didn't feel like currently she was being neglected and nothing bad had happened yet. So she's not going to say, oh, they're trash yet. But she wants to see more to be done.
Okay, so to sum up, like, you know, conceptualise around this. I've written a lot about relations of affinity and stuff like that before, but like, obviously someone that feels comfortable in a venue, that has more kind of connection to it through their own aesthetics, tastes, practices, that kind of thing, tends to kind of enjoy the work more, and tends, I would say, therefore, to contribute to creating the vibe in a much more kind of maybe easier, kind of lubricated way than someone that doesn't really kind of fit in. So we have a kind of quote that, in the previous paper, for instance, you know, someone working at a pub with live music, you know, and she felt like she was in a lounge room there. She was that comfortable. So these kind of class relations can go up or down as well, particularly when it comes to dealing with problems. And often our bar workers would refer to people that kind of are really above them economically as having less class. I think that's an important point as well. Class here tends to be associated with ethics and values, and probably cultural and subcultural capitals, more so than money, particularly in the inner north, that it's kind of seen as vulgar. The particular stereotype of the kind of, you know, middle-aged white dude with the credit card, you know, telling everyone what to do was kind of something that comes up quite a bit. So, you know, when talking about that kind of relationship, we have Greg with one of my favourite quotes in the whole project. We're talking about the Chrysler brand dickhead as opposed to the Datsun brand dickhead. And to sum up overall, so, you know, I think throughout the presentations that we've had today, you can see, you know, in terms of kind of conceptual and theoretical understandings of this stuff, all the forms of labour, in a way, are going on in this space in one way or another. And the data that we have, I think, both engages with those theories really well, but also kind of challenges some of the taken for granted aspects of those things. And we can see all the time, like, blurriness between work and leisure, and production, consumption, and labour and play. But really, the workers are kind of maintaining that line, and it's not something that's kind of easily shed. Even when they're having fun in these spaces, it still feels like work more often than not. We've got a previous paper on gentrification, and I think Lena and I will kind of write through the lens of gentrification through this, particularly because Lena's got previous experience with that in her honours thesis. And I think what might import in the idea that Megan and I have worked on in terms of reflexive complicity. Like, so we have kind of, you know, lots of lefty identifying kind of people in this space that kind of know what's going on around them. They kind of can see that they're part of the gentrification, but it's kind of a, you know, what am I going to do kind of attitude towards it. So class emerges through these kind of aesthetics, through these relations, through these banal everyday interactions. And these can range from the seemingly mundane to, like, you know, a shitty toilet, through to physically violent interactions. So I think the aesthetics and the senses are really important to our analysis through all the kind of different lenses that we've looked at today. And, you know, good venues are good at managing this stuff, I think, and having some correlation between the workers and the punters. Might leave it there. Thanks.
I have the mic. Everyone would like to say.
Got to use the mic if you can't talk.
Does anyone would like to say anything to Steve and Lena?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Lena. Really interesting presentation. I want to pick up on one thing, just, and this was a bit of a passing comment, Steve, that you made just about hysteresis. And I guess what I was kind of, as I was listening to what you were saying, I guess the hysteresis that had formed for that person who was being forced to wear different clothing, like present a different aesthetic for the venue, was perhaps one of the most productive spaces, actually, like, surfacing that, you know, the normalization of these workplaces and what they're becoming, in the sense that people start reflecting in ways that perhaps are not so complicit. So just kind of, I guess, a question about the ways that yeah, I guess hysteresis might be productive in the data set, and if you saw more of that throughout as you were analysing the data.
I'll let you reflect on them more a bit, but like firstly, I think it's a particular idiosyncratic example with her because she was working in the youth sector and hospitality and trying to get out. So I think this moment was like a real point where she's like, enough.
She was very fuck this.
Yeah. So maybe in that sense, hysteresis isn't quite the right way to theorise it, in the sense that it was a bit more gradual in this kind of one moment. But this was definitely a moment where she was like, okay, enough's enough. I can't be doing this anymore. I think hysteresis will be useful in the project when we're talking about specific instances of overt violence, when that changes people's orientation towards the job in particular. Do you want to talk about morbid?
I don't know what hysteresis means.
It means like a kind of, if someone experiences a moment where it kind of their whole kind of being, their kind of habitus in that sense, is disconnected from their expectations. So
okay, right.
It's theorised like when someone moves country or someone's made redundant or someone gets divorced, it really changes their life. Yeah.
Yeah, there are other participants who speak of that sort of like switch, I'd say. Not in such rich detail as this one participant who went on several tangents during the interview and was super generous in that way.
Yep.
Really. I guess, yeah, there's a couple I can think of who experience like sexual harassment from their bosses, and would decide like I'm going to be really like strategic in the way that I choose workplaces or the way that I'm going to function in this industry. There's a couple of the different stories like that as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Would anyone else like to say anything? So this is the second time I've done this, but I'm going to ask something because this is, as they said, a work in progress. So actually, I'm also thinking about this as I kind of see this paper. I think that one of the really big things in what you're doing is the way that you're posing class as a series of strategic tensions that doesn't map onto a neat homology of positions, but a series of kind of tensions that workers are negotiating and enacting differently over time. And it's not that there is a class background that then maps onto the venues that they work at or anything like that, because the industry just doesn't work like that. It's more that different venues pose different problems for workers, depending on the aesthetics of the venues, the clientele, the nature of the labour, participants' own aesthetics, their subcultural tastes, their other interests aside from work, things like that. And that, I mean, I think it's going to be like quite generative for thinking about class, but it is going to challenge, I think, in some ways, the way we're used to thinking about class and its relationship with work.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we do have like some anecdotal stories about how class matters in terms of not being a lifer, right? So, if you're from a relatively privileged background and you're doing a uni degree and you're doing this stuff on the side, you're not really going to get so-called trapped in hospitality unless, as compared to like some of our less privileged cohorts, and we've got some prominent examples of that like ended up doing for many years and couldn't really get out, and some of them are still in there, some of them are getting out in their 30s. So, but yeah, I think the relationality aspect is really important, and I think you're right that the way that things are produced in these spaces, in terms of lots of diverse people in a way coming together in them, but you can see a very obvious kind of class aesthetic or a class thing happening, I think is really interesting. I don't think it's either or. I'm kind of very agnostic about ways of thinking about class. I think all the models have something to say in one respect or another, but I think this is going to be really interesting to think through that, yeah. So it's quite Borgesian in a sense in one way, but like we're not going to be talking about this person has so many capitals and that kind of stuff. We're going to be talking about what's maybe produced in the space itself rather than what's brought to the space, I think, is a way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And I think it really sort of, I feel like you said microphone a little bit. I think what you said at the end about aesthetics and taste and the senses, you know, I feel like as we kind of began the project in this way, that the venues themselves orient patron and customers around, you know, the aesthetics they present, the vibe that they promise through those aesthetics. And people, I think the way that people know how to read those aesthetics and how they feel in those places, comfortable and uncomfortable, is one of the ways that class really surfaces, as you said. But I think that's another kind of really productive way to keep going.
Yeah, something that I was kept thinking about during your paper, Julia, was and also relates through the distinction between customers, venue owners, and workers, is about power, taste, and capital, and how that can produce vibe, relations of affinity through aesthetics, but also conflict and tension.
Yeah. And I think the kind of whole relationality thing we're talking to, like, people are still bringing themselves to work, right? And they're going to have struggles in those spaces to fit in or not. And so that's also where kind of, I think, class is going to come into play to analyse this stuff. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Brian, and my question is not something to do with aesthetic, but of course I was also thinking about who defines aesthetic in that particular space or scene. So is it, of course, the workers themselves, or their, you know, the bosses or their patrons? But my question is something to do with, they talk about young people on this work economy and service economy, but I was just wondering if the years of experiences with these people has got to do with how, or is shaping their decisions, if there are cases of staying and leaving in that particular service economy. Like you mentioned that there was this one particular person, they left, and she left or he left, and that could be the reason for those individuals who stayed, probably that could shape, you know, something to do with sociality or relationality in that particular aspect. I don't know. Thank you.
I mean, I think I can speak to that in terms of, you know, in the first paper we wrote, and I've written a little about it in a new thing that I've just written as well, is about the ageing hospitality worker is a struggle. If you've been working in hospitality since you're 18, say, it's likely that you've drunk too much. It's likely that you're going to have sore legs and feet, and, you know, bad back. So there's we have some, like, is it in the first paper, Dave, that, yeah, that, like, people trying to kind of get out, but, like, you know, don't really have the means to, in a way, or they start to get jealous of their friends who, you know, have got real lives, that they're kind of stuck in this still, like, not real job kind of thing. So once you kind of, and that happens to people, I think, that kind of maybe started while they're doing uni and then, like, dropped out of uni for whatever reasons or whatever, or, you know, were back and forth and haven't finished their degrees, a particular trajectory that happens there.
We had a number of, in this current phase of the project, we have a number of participants who only just started working in hospitality in the last couple of years, and they're in their mid to late 20s, and they consider hospo as their side hustle, or like their second job to whatever else is, like, the main thing that they've got going on, because they were suddenly a little bit more available and their local bar or cafe needed something, but they like having that extra income. And some have, there was one person I spoke to who said, like, this was my side hustle, but now I would really love doing this. So there's another aspect there as well.
And on the other side of things, I thought, as Dave said earlier on, no matter what role you're doing in this, you kind of get paid the same. Like, if you get a management job, you might get another $5 an hour. There's no, like, pyramid to climb, you know. So that's a kind of thing as well to consider in terms of how people feel stuck. Doing it, there doesn't seem to be like a payoff in the end. It's just, it ends up being a grind, I think. And so people try and get out and make plans to get out, and some do and some don't.
I was just going to say, I've extended some of this in my own research, and some of the queer participants talk about, like, mobility, and how if they move to different places, they will often get a job in hospitality, in a cafe or a bar, so that they can meet people. They have no intention of staying at the bar or the cafe, but they're like, you know, I turned up in this regional town in Victoria, and I wanted to get to know folks, so I got a job at the theatre, because I knew that's where everyone went. Now I've got heaps of mates, and through those connections, I've gotten a different job in social work or, you know, wherever their kind of interest is. Yeah, which I thought was interesting. So they'll really leverage.
And if I could say one more thing kind of to conclude too, I mean, one of the things that we'd like to maybe contribute publicly in relation to what Mahalia said before is like, yeah, the idea that hospitality work is unskilled is just like utter bullshit. You know, sure, pouring a beer and whatever is relatively straightforward, but like you can see all the things that are going on in the data that we're presented, that there's a whole bunch of different skills going on that are completely unrewarded and unappreciated. So I don't know, I think maybe the kind of one of the public interventions that we'd like to make is for, you know, punters to think a little bit more about that when they're kind of in venues and the way that they talk to staff and their expectations of things, because we can see very much that like there's a whole bunch of skills going on, but like the skills seem to be relying upon the acceptance of destroying that kind of separation between production, consumption, work and leisure, which doesn't really happen for the workers themselves.
I actually wanted to kind of follow up on that, because while I was listening to all of this, that really struck me, the multiple kind of layers of skills that the hospitality workers have. And I was wondering, like obviously that's a huge kind of public contribution that you can make, but do you have any thoughts about how you would do that? Like what would that contribution look like? What form could it take? Any ideas?
Oh, look, not really. I mean, we're writing reports and we were talking to unions, but the main union we were talking to carked it because it made some dodgy decisions and everyone turned on it and it no longer exists. So, like, you know, that's the kind of space we're hoping to move into to begin with and kind of take it from there. But, yeah, that's something that we're not great at and we need to get better at for sure.